Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another installment of When in Romans with us guys from Hampton Roads Church. We've been going through the book of Romans in our Sunday preaching schedule. And of late, we have stumbled into chapter 9, which is just an amazingly dense, mysterious, and often overlooked chapter in this particular letter. It's not one of the ones that people go to for like proof texts. Nor is it a place where people necessarily go to find great encouragement. It's where people tend to find themselves quite lost and wishing they hadn't started reading the chapter at all. But there's as we learned last time with Alex's exposition of the first 5 verses, there's so much here to be learned about not only Paul's heart, but of course what that's pointing to, which is the heart of God and the amazing mysteries of his intense knowledge and unquestionable ways, quite frankly. And this morning, Ed preached on verses 6 through 33, the end of the chapter. Quite a mouthful to chew on a Sunday morning, but Ed did a fantastic job, and we're going to kind of pick up with that here this evening. We have Ed, of course, here, Ed Anton, Matt Barbaro, Alex Hernandez, who preached last week, and of course myself, Tim Reese. Ed, tell us. You had a lot to say this morning. Tell us what went well. I would like to comment before we get started that I thought your slides were phenomenal, as always. But tell us what did you I can imagine what you preached on today was an ambitious undertaking, and I'm sure that you had thoughts of, okay, I really hope this gets across. I really hope this gets across. I really hope that I can, edify the church on this point and on that point. So, before we get into, some of the funner parts of the conversation, which is, what didn't you cover? Tell us what you think landed really well. We'd love to hear from you on that.
Well, thanks. And you're right. This was a bit daunting, thinking about tackling, such a difficult passage like this one. And as I went after it, I knew that it would be very easy to get into the weeds. And there's 2 big weed fields that I mentioned, and they're marked by 2 questions. One in verse 14 of Romans 9, where Paul anticipates an objection. Paul's so good at this, right? He quotes something, and normally he's quoting something from the Old Testament to kind of reinforce an idea. And after he quotes it, he's like, oh, snap. If I say this, they're going to think this. So let me go ahead and bring it up. So after Paul says, Jacob I loved, but Esau he hated, then Paul says, oh, wait. Is there injustice on God's part? Should we be looking at whether God is unfair in a sense? And then later on, after he talks about, hey, God's going to use people, all right? Then in verse 19, he says, well, then you're going to say to me, well, why does he still find fault? Who's going to resist his will? Hey, if he's that sovereign and he's kind of moving us around on the chessboard or, controlling the strings of the marionette, well, then why do we have any human responsibility if that's the case? There is so much in just those 2 questions that have filled book after book after book that it was very tempting to go down there. But having reread it, this was one I reread a lot. I wanted to make sure I kept looking. A paper Bible meant so much this time, by the way, maybe because there's just so many verses to wrestle with. But there's something about having the full landscape there and realizing, no, this is not necessarily about that. God is trying to show, first of all, that the word of God has not failed. Everything that he has predicted, everything that has been fulfilled in Jesus has not failed, just because this room in which Phoebe is reading this letter is not filled with Jews in the first century. It's filled most likely with a whole bunch of Gentiles. Didn't help that Claudius shipped out the Jews, and now they're trickling back in. But nonetheless, it's a room full of Gentiles. What are we to do about that? How is it that God's word has not really failed? And by the way, if you're trying to say that God's word has failed because we don't have a ton of Israelites all over the place here, well, first of all, let me begin with saying not all Israel is Israel. I mean, that's the beginning statement. There's all of ethnic Israel, but there's really just some of Israel who are really Israel, right? Really God's people is another way of saying that. And it is a significant subset of ethnic Israel that turns out to be true Israel. And that would include somebody like a Paul and the 3,000 that were baptized in Acts chapter 2 and the beginning of the church in Rome before it got scattered and then reconstituted with a whole lot of Gentiles. So there is a remnant of Israel. Now, from that, Paul then wants to help everybody realize that the gospel has not failed. So he's kind of like, you shouldn't be surprised that God exercises choice. And for example, when God wiped out everything with the flood, he then said, go be fruitful and multiply. And right after that, we get Genesis 10 and we get all the 70 nations of the earth. But you know what? God didn't work with all those nations to try to help the sinful nature of man. The flood didn't help enough. And so now he decides he's going to work through Abraham. And verse 7 of chapter 9 says that, hey, he begins with Abraham. But by the way, he didn't work through all of Abraham's kids. He had 2 kids, Isaac and Ishmael, but he only worked through Isaac. And by the way, you shouldn't be surprised that that the fine tuning and the choosing and the divine selection continues, because Isaac had 2 kids. And now we're not talking about 2 kids, one from a slave woman, one from a promise, one from an Egyptian woman, one from a Israelite woman. Now we're talking about exactly the same. 2 kids, not even born yet, and they're twins. So even playing field, and even in that even playing field, God makes a choice again. And this time the choice, of course, is Jacob, as he makes this argument. And then as the end of that argument comes down, he uses the language of choice, and I'm not going to get into all of that here, but the language of choice that would not have shocked the first century audience is Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Malachi uses that language too, but it's just the language of choice. It doesn't mean that God actually hated Esau. He certainly opposed the Edomites, the people of Esau, later in Malachi, but right here we're not talking about that. We're just talking about Jacob and Esau. And so the language of choice is appropriate. So with that, then, right, we've got the audience now all hearing from Paul that don't be surprised that God actually picks certain players to carry the ball, to carry his purposes forward, to help alleviate the evil condition of mankind. God is on a mission. It's a big one. It's more than we can understand. He didn't use the 70 nations. He used one. He didn't just use Abraham of that nation. He just used Isaac. Didn't just use Isaac. In all of his kids, he just used Jacob. And then, by the way, Jacob along the way had to be refined. And God even used some evil players now, like Pharaoh. And God can use him on the other side of the equation too, in that Pharaoh was already bent on nasty. So why not use him? And so God did. He actually even used him just to show you that God gets in there in human affairs and really cares. And he is trying to move the pieces because he wants all the nations to come back. In order for that to happen, he needed all of those conditions to happen in Israel for them to understand what it's like to be set free. That's going to find its greater fulfillment in the Messiah, who is a freedom fighter himself for all of us and will set us all free. And ultimately, it's all going to come down to not just the Jews, but who the Jews produce. And God will ultimately realize, I'm choosing now my son. And it's all going to come down to him. But by the way, if you're in him, you have the status of having been chosen as well. And this idea of being chosen or elected is now not just because God picks you, it's because you now have human agency. You have human free will to choose Jesus. Sadly, a lot of Israel did not choose Jesus. And so he became the stone on which they stumbled. But a lot of others, actually did choose him, and in him they will never be put to shame. And why is it that so many did not make it? Because God just kind of, from all of prehistory, regarded them as reprobate, and they were doomed to destruction from before their birth? No, that's not what Paul answers. Why? Verse 32, because they didn't pursue it by faith. And so we still play a role, even though God is orchestrating, we still play an ultimate role, but that role becomes much bigger in Jesus because we exercise faith to enter into him. And when we enter into him, we enter into the choice. But the language of choice, the language of election, is the language of purpose. And that when you get brought into this, you're actually given the honor of purpose, not just the status of, hey, feel good about yourself. You feel much better about yourself, not just by having status, by actually having status where God actually entrusts to you some real stuff to do. And when you do that, it only reinforces it all. And what are you doing? You're saving the world. Ain't nothing bigger than that. So that was the kind of the main flow of the whole thing. And of course, the charge to all of us that, hey, you know what? All Jesus ain't Jesus. Let's make sure that we're being Jesus and we're doing the purposes of God.
You know, Ed, when you were reading through this morning, and there were so many of these questions that Paul asks that sort of, you know, he entertains questioning God, sort of, you know, well, is God unjust? And that sort of repeats throughout and throughout. And it reminded me of Job. Job, eventually reached this point where he was questioning God, and that's sort of the theme of the book. And I don't know, maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but I find it very interesting that Job was from Uz, which is in Edom. You know, so like Job.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Job was this righteous man, you know, that had favor from God, ultimately, tested God's patience, but was given a great repentance at the end. And all along, he's not he's of Edom. he's not a Jew. And it struck me as that, this God is frequently pointing out the faithful that are not pointing out the non-Israelites that are Israelites. Job was not from the line of Jacob, but he was an Israelite. In faith. Ruth, not an Israelite, but an Israelite in faith. I just thought that was it all seemed to fit really well, I thought.
Because it does work to his bigger agenda of writing the letter and making sure that the church stays unified and doesn't divide along Gentile Jew lines. So those are good insights that he would pick some things. I don't know if a Gentile would pick up on the nuances of that. Maybe some would if learned, because they're hanging on the scriptures and probably loving some of those nuances. But a Jew would probably be like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. we're probably on more level ground than I realize.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how many things that Paul reveals that when you really look at it, that Jesus also already revealed in like the Gospels, like a lot of times we think it's just Paul, but Jesus usually touches on most of it. And like one of those was like in John 8, how Jesus kind of touched on the same principle with, saying to the Jews, like, I know that you're, of Abraham, like kind of like, I know you're his lineage. He's like, but you're not. If you were really of him, you would be doing the works that he did. He's like, you're of your father, the devil. So he kind of right there shows that there's this spiritual, lineage.
And even before Jesus comes, right? John the Baptist is saying to the crowds coming out to him,
raise it up.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah.
No, don't be making some claim that you're good with God. You know what? God can raise up children of Abraham from these rocks.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. That's
just kind of got ushered in right away. You're like in the New Testament, basically. It was like a theme that got ushered in.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that there's a little thumb in the eye of a lot of the better Jews when when that same Gospel of Luke ends with Nehemiah, I'm sorry, with Zacchaeus, right? When Jesus calls Zacchaeus, now here is a true child of Abraham. Kind of a bookend to what began with John the Baptist. But now here is a true child of Abraham, and here we have too, probably Paul saying, hey, not all who claim to be children of Abraham are children of Abraham.
No, I this is a hard chapter, hard, like hard chapter, and I did appreciate that, how you presented it. I mean, even the section there where he says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Yeah, he's addressing what they're probably thinking, but it was great that you mentioned it today, because we're thinking it from a westernized mindset.
Yes.
And to be able to explain that and use other references. You use Luke 14 about, love my father, hate my mother and father. I thought that was very helpful to begin trying to understand how they would have saw it, that it was a choice. But even along the way, I actually thought it was great how you went through Abraham and God choosing Abraham. Even that slide, that was pretty cool. I didn't realize you missed one, and I would have never missed one. I would never even known. You could have made up some names up there. But how Isaac and Ishmael, I thought that was awesome. And choosing even there between Jacob and Esau, that was just, I loved it. I actually thought it was even great to show God's character, where Pharaoh, I think you mentioned he's a mess, a hot mess, and yet God still knows that. And he still chooses to use this mess, which was still, I love that. It was
otherwise he's a total waste.
And no, it's like there's no argument, because we start going, why'd you Pharaoh? Really? No, that has nothing to do. God is going to be God, and he's going to choose who he wants to choose.
And the purpose language that Paul uses with Pharaoh is still the same purpose language that's positive for being chosen, right? What was the purpose language? To show my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Like that's always in the background when God is doing some electing.
Yes, that in itself is something to chew on, by the way. Like he's not thinking of the moment. He's a bigger picture. He's got a picture that we don't even comprehend.
Those 70 nations are still in God's sight during all of this, right? What's going to get to all of them eventually? I got to bring them back. Under
didn't we just hit like 8 billion?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, we did. We just hit 8 billion, and
God's got 8 billion in his sights right now, working it out.
How fast did we go from 7 billion to 8 billion? Well, it was, it's pretty amazing how many people are out there. You go, but God has the four.
Matt's doing his part, man. Any day now.
Who is?
Matt's going to be a dad in like a day or so.
Are you?
Yeah, on Wednesday.
How many kids do you have?
This is just going to be my first kid.
Oh, buckle up, buddy.
It's going to be a daughter. Alex, it's going to be a daughter.
That's
Any
how he
advice? Daughters? You guys, Ed has daughters. Any advice?
Alex went daughter.
Alex has a daughter, right?
You went daughter.
No.
That's how he started.
Daughter, son,
yeah.
Daughter.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. I thought you went daughter, son.
So any advice, Alex, or no?
Hey, man.
He's still figuring it out.
There you go. Back to the text.
Yeah. Actually, hey, can I just say, you're having a daughter, huh?
Yeah.
Chapter 10 is a little bit easier than having a daughter. so
Oh my God.
No, congratulations, brother.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this
Um,
Wednesday, if you guys can say prayers, that'd be greatly appreciated.
So what do you guys think about the idea that I did not lean into the idea that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but that I was fine with the idea that God hardened his heart? Because
I thought it was good, Ed. I thought it was very controversial. I liked it. People were upset by it, so that was good. I heard people grumbling and murmuring. I liked it, Ed. You were like, hey, let's not even go down that road. Let's not soften it up. You're like, Pharaoh was a useless guy. You know, if it walks like a duck and it acts like a duck. I liked it, Ed. You know, you were like, don't sugarcoat it, because you were saying it's not really relevant in the context. Because, right, you're saying like they're using something that's just in the Exodus story, but you're saying that
Sure.
wasn't the point of him mentioning it here, right? Wasn't that your point?
I get what you're saying.
somewhat, but I also said that, hey, even in the Exodus story, we get 10 times God hardened, 10 times Pharaoh hardened his heart. We get that of the references, but it begins with God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Even back to
Right.
Exodus 3, the burning bush. It starts there with, I will harden his heart.
Right.
Is the plan.
Right.
So it doesn't just start with, hey, I'm going to take this guy whose heart is already hard, and I'm going to slap another coat of cement over it, of callus over it. No, I'm going to actually take a guy that is bent on nasty, I think I said, and go ahead and take him all the way down the path that he would go, if not for me intervening to try to soften him.
And did he even, and this, Ed, I'm not positive, but did he even tell Abraham this even too? Did he even tell Abraham something like, I'm gonna like 430 years like down
He
the
did
line?
tell him that.
And did he say I'm gonna harden his heart?
He didn't talk about hardening his heart, but in Genesis 15, he did say your people will go down into a foreign nation and be slaves for 430 years.
Wow. So this was like clearly like a bigger,
Like,
you know.
God had this worked out, right? I mean, if he could say that in Genesis 15 of, now we're now a couple hundred years later where they go into slavery, and then 430 years into slavery. Like it's at the end of the 430 years of slavery that then everything happens with Pharaoh, right? I mean, God is working it out for all the nations to come back. Who are we to shake our fist at him when he's already worked out the plan from 700 years earlier with Abraham?
Wow.
I thought that this was a really good text not to, I think we all at one time or another have a really bad impulse to try to explain things away in the Bible. And I really feel like recently I encounter more and more, Christians in our own movement who just really think God's being unfair in some fashion. And, while on the human level, I certainly see their point, because I am a weak, sinful ant of a person too, but if there's one thing the Bible tells me is that God's ways are higher than mine. And, I already mentioned the book of Job. If there's one thing that book tells me is that, God defines good. He's not subject to our definitions of it. So I think it's perfectly appropriate to let the Bible be the Bible. And, I need to conform to it, not the other way around.
One of the better Christian philosophical theodicies, or arguments for the justice of God, which is what theodicy means. Theo, God, dikio, dikaio, righteous, fair. But one of the better arguments have been, if you can shake your fist at God because you view them to be powerful enough and intimately involved enough to be responsible for all of these human hurts, then you also then need to ascribe to him the power to have an agenda that is at work to make all of this optimal. And that you do have to, unfortunately, break some eggs to make some omelets along the way. But you can't have a God that you're going to shake your fist at for these issues without also recognizing that he would also have to be a God who is brilliant enough to be working out something that is going to be pretty amazing when we finally get to see it in the end.
Yeah.
But it's hard. We always explain away God. We always explain away the hard edges of God. And I think there's a fallout to that. We lose fear of the Lord. We want to make sure that he's always kind, he's always nice. And we're okay with maybe undermining a bit of his sovereignty so that we can say, well, that's not what he really meant. This was only Pharaoh already having hardened his heart. God would never do that. God would never harden his heart. Maybe he would. Maybe in God's big plan, it's worth it to harden this guy's heart. So that at the end of the day, the utility of the nations coming back are more than worth it.
There's it is interesting even to wrestle with, because we see God as, we come to God, we share how, come to me when you're weary and burdened, you go to God. But do I understand this, that the God I'm serving has always had and has an agenda? Just right. Grasping that, just grasping.
Well, or we're thinking he really didn't think about all this, and now he has to.
God, what I'm serving a God who has an agenda. Like, so it changes things for me. Like, let me just, hey God, how you doing? Can you pray? Can you please give me this, give me that, or give me? No. Has his character is being displayed. He has an agenda, even to the point of using a non-Israelite, non-Jew, in this case, Pharaoh. He has a bigger purpose. And am I okay with that? Well, I have no option, right? But the idea that, hang on here, do I grasp that he has a clear agenda, and that can be offensive to some people.
Yeah, amen. One thing before we get to, because I think we'll probably start to move down to the next question in a second here, right? Why does he find fault, or why does he find us responsible? Well, one thing I was happy to have thought of was that the fact that he used the phrase, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Now, by the way, when you go and read this in Malachi, you're like, well, he really did hate Esau. He was like, you know what? Even if you start to have any good times, Edomites, I'm going to crush it. I'm going to send plagues. I'm going to send locusts. I'm going to send famine. You think you're going to rebuild? As soon as you rebuild, I'm smashing it back down again. Like, whoa, he really did hate it. But that's the Edomites who were so cruel to Israel that he's talking about there in Malachi. He's not trying to talk about it here. He's trying to talk literally about the older son will serve the younger, as it was written. I've got the language of now he's using the language of choice. But why is that clear? I think it was helpful to realize this reading, or this time studying it, is that the objection question that comes up, is there injustice on God's part, is the question about choosing Jacob. It's the question about choice, not the question about hatred. If anybody was really concerned about God having a hatred spirit, he would have asked that. But nobody would have been concerned, because they realize that it's simply an idiom. As I mentioned, it's not really dropping cats and dogs onto the pavement. It's just a heavy rain. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. It's not actually God raining down hatred upon that other twin from jump from the womb on, but instead having chosen Jacob for special purposes. So again, the fact that it's not an issue is shown in the question that's asked in the next verse. No, Paul does not ask the question, why is God hating? No, it's, hey, is God's sovereign choice justice fair? Is that fair or not? So anyway, I thought that was helpful, that we don't have to deal with the whole hate issue, because it obviously was not an issue. It was a complete non-issue. It's just a language thing.
Hey, Ed. I'm going to ask you a tough question, okay? Just to like make this show interesting. All right.
Beautiful. I love you.
All right. You like it though, right? Because it helps strengthen the work. It's all good. I'm not trying to be like a trickster or whatever. But here's a tough question. All right. So do you think for sure that there's not a salvation component in this choice in this chapter?
If I did not say this, then I messed up. I meant to say that there are purposes involved in election, but it gets intermingled because the purposes have to do with salvation.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
I said that,
Yeah.
but if I didn't say that, bad on me, because salvation is definitely in view.
Yeah, that's what okay, perfect. That's what I was wondering. All right.
The purposes are salvation, but the fact that certain agents are in play is not salvific unto itself to them.
Okay.
Right? They just happen to be an agent to bring about optimal conditions for the nations to come back to Jesus, to come back.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but the confusion is it's purposeful, but the purpose has everything to do with salvation.
Okay, gotcha.
Hey, you know what I didn't talk about at all was this whole like Potter thing. Right. And I mean, it's cool stuff, right? It's that Jeremiah stuff. It's definitely interesting. Does what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? I just thought it was more about the whole, hey, why am I being held accountable type stuff from God, which I thought, hey, let me also recognize, hey, God's using us for certain things. So I didn't get into it. It would have been a sermon unto itself. But I don't know, you guys have any thoughts like on the whole? Hey, it's still very difficult language. The potter has the right from one lump to make one pot for honorable use and another pot for dishonorable use. Like, oh, dag, look what God's going to do from the lump, not from once they're two pots, right? All right, two pots are made. One's obviously a leaky pot. I'm going to use that for dishonorable purposes. It's from the lump. If you know what I'm saying, like.
All right, so then I have another tough question. Would you say that this lump is what, the fallen humanity after Adam and Eve, basically? Is that the lump?
Might be something before that.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm wondering. What do you think? I really don't know the answer. What do you guys think? That's a tough question though, right?
You know what? I'll have the answer for you.
What is it?
Okay. But Tim, break it down for me.
Let's hear it.
Go, Tim.
He knows that Tim knows, so he's giving us the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I know, but I do think that a study of the scriptures sort of reveals this all throughout. After all, Christ himself was presented lowly in his he was humble and he was poor and he was didn't stand out, and he became the subject of wrath, but yet he was the Christ, and all throughout the Old Testament, when we're reading the law, we hear about God's special attention for the poor and the widows and the orphans, all of the things that you would say, don't make me into that. Those are the things that God loves. The women throughout the Old Testament that are exalted are prostitutes, and it's like, oh God, whatever you do, don't make my daughter a prostitute. But then yet you see Rahab, so in my mind, it's like how dare God make me into a common lump of clay instead of the glorious lump of clay that I should be in my own mind. But God uses the weak, and he uses the disgraceful, and he he glorifies himself through these things. And it's only our very arrogant God playing proclivities that even cause us to pass judgment as on what is high and what is lowly.
But wouldn't in this scenario, wouldn't the dishonorable used to be like the people like Pharaoh though and Esau?
Yeah, so then it's like, yes, I think you're exactly right. But then I think I just have to ask myself, okay, it took me a while to understand everything I just explained to you. Might I understand the next level down one day if I'm humble and study it out and try?
Okay.
And open
That
my
makes
mind
sense.
to God.
That
And
makes
have one of those Job moments. You think about Job. How could this possibly be fair? How could what God is doing to me? What possible explanation could there be for what's happening? And then all of a sudden, he sees God differently than he's ever seen him before, and all of his questions go away.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Mm.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I guess these are just very difficult questions because we just don't really understand God fully,
So, I mean, this goes to Calvin's doctrine of not only election, but the more difficult complement to it, reprobation. Reprobation means that God has prepared people from before the history of the world for damnation. They're the reprobates. And also the elected are those that were prepared before the history of the world for salvation. And Calvin would fight for this. He says individuals are born. This is in book 3, chapter 23 of his Institutes. Individuals are born who are doomed from the womb to certain death and are to glorify God by their destruction. That's how they go. Like, oof. And then when he realizes that people are uncomfortable with some of the things that he's saying, and later he answers objections. And he says many Christians professing a desire to defend the deity from this charge admit the doctrine of election, but deny that anyone is reprobated. This they do ignorantly and childishly. There could be no election without its opposite, reprobation. Yeah, so Calvin's leaning in hard on this. He's like, that lump is predestined thoughts of God. And in those predestined thoughts of God, once it's just a lump, ends up being pots. Some pots are elected to salvation, and some are reprobate for eternal damnation. And it was already chosen even before they end up on the potter's wheel.
Wow.
That's tough, right? Of course. But what saves us in this chapter is verse 30. What shall we say then? That Gentiles did not pursue righteousness, have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith, but that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. So the question is what? So Israel isn't saved. Why? Okay, so this is a big why, verse 32. Why? Now, if he was holding to Institutes book 3, chapter 23, what do you think he would say? He would say, well,
they were predestined for destruction.
Yeah. Exactly. That would be the answer. But Paul doesn't say that. Why? Because they didn't pursue it by faith. So this is not about predestined reprobation or election. We're predestined when we enter into Christ because Christ is predestined. They didn't pursue it by faith. Their own faith choice is what caused them to stumble. They got Jesus, but they stumbled over the stumbling stone instead of embracing it. There's nothing unfair in that. I gave them all I had, right? That whole list that we looked at in the verses 3, 4, and 5 of right. They had the law, the patriarchs, the promises. They got the hookup, but then when they see Jesus, what do? Man, they stumbled. They stumbled on it. They weren't predestined to that. So I think that's the tension here. And some would call that, well, then we default to compatibilism. And I think there is a version of that's got to be right. Compatibilism means that there is a way to see the compatibility between the sovereign will of God and the free will of man.
Right.
Those things do work together in some intricate dance.
Yeah.
with God being able to understand it all. That opens up whole kind of cans of worms of like middle knowledge and all sorts of different, like God knows 1,000 scenarios for every one of our decisions, and he can actually intervene to kind of guide and move some things. That's all where it's just like mind blow type stuff. And it's, not really in this passage.
Right.
But a lot of people like to think about it.
Mm.
What I mean by middle knowledge is that God knows every possible scenario of Pharaoh, of Jacob, of Alex, Tim, and Matt. He knows every choice that you make and every choice that'll affect. And how do we know that? Because when David is being pursued by Saul, he goes to God and says, will the elders of Keilah, or whatever cities he's in, when Saul comes, will they hand me over? And God says, yes, they will hand you over. So God knows that if David decides to stay there, the scenario that would play itself out, and I think that's 2 Kings, 1 Kings, where that is, the scenario that would play itself out is those, but that doesn't happen. Why? Because God intervenes in human history and changes a course of human history that he knew would happen, but he's able to alter it by being able to give David the encouragement to go in another direction.
Well, that's very interesting. Do you believe in that middle knowledge stuff? Is that something you believe in, Ed? Because I've never even heard of that. So
it's mind blowing. There was a kind of a monk type guy, Christian philosopher in medieval times named Molina. His idea was Molinism. Here's the concept really quickly. There's a gazillion billion scenarios where we all play out our free will. God bumps in here and there with some interventions, right? Arranges time and place. We can all seek him. He does that over and over again, right? But God knows every possible scenario. Let's just say the four of us making all different choices in our decision trees and how they play against each other, and it creates a wall of Earth in 2110, right? Like that's Earth in 2110, based on all of our different decisions. Now, how many different Earths are there based on the 8 billion different decisions? It's all over the place. Molinism says that God looks at all those possible Earths when Jesus returns, right? Let's say Jesus returns in the year 3000. These are all the possible playouts of the history of Earth to the year 3000. There are more than we could begin to count, right? And God picks that one right there. Why? Because it's optimal. Most are saved, most come to him. It's the best scenario that could be, and he allows that one to be the one that plays itself out.
That's interesting.
Again, it's just a theory, but
Right.
it's one that tries to make sense of this intersection of God's sovereignty, man's free will, working together, and yet God's still using it to create the best possible outcome of the impact of Jesus being the widest.
Wow.
Tough stuff.
Jesus being the whitest, did you say? Or the widest?
Wide.
I'm joking. Sorry. Edit it
I'm
out.
sorry, guys. I'm leaving. I'm in the wrong.
Ed, edit it out. We'll just. That would be like not an optimal situation in the whole.
Right. I guess.
Yeah, Jesus being white is not optimal.
So the Molina guy is kind of like a Doctor Strange character, right?
That's what I was thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Metaverse.
Yeah,
Right. He knows the 13 billion 500 scenarios. He knows that there's one out of those that would probably be pleasing to God.
Oh man.
So Ed, with the Paul question, I loved how when he says like, the question like, why does he still find fault? Who can resist his will? And then it's just, I loved how Paul just brings that question up, and then you think he's gonna give like an answer.
Yes, it's just like Job, right? It's just like Job. Going back to that again.
But he doesn't even answer it. He's just like, that's a ridiculous line of inquiry and it's not applicable. We're not going down that road.
Don't you wish you could do that in court?
but he probably, hey, no, he gets it done to him. The judge is like, yeah, discontinue this line of questioning, counselor. There's no point to this.
But it is, right? Job is okay. I shut my mouth, right? I shut my mouth. What in the world? And then we get these like really beautiful quotes from Hosea, where suddenly the Gentiles seem to be the ones that are being brought in, right? Those who are not my people will be called my people, and at least that's what I'm thinking. I mean, is that what you guys are thinking? Because he says, but also the Gentiles in verse 24, and then he goes to Hosea. And it seems like he's now using the Hosea stuff to apply to the Gentiles. Right?
I feel like that's clearly what he's doing there.
Okay, yeah. Those like illicit children of Gomer are
I feel like he even I feel like he foreshadows that earlier when he quotes the Malachi passage, because he's quoting Malachi 1 verse 2, I think. But when you read on to verse 5, after God talks about if they try to rebuild, I will destroy. But at the end, he says, so that my glory will be seen beyond the borders of Israel. I know that's not exactly what he's saying in Malachi, but I feel like there's some play in those words, that even the destruction of Edom is meant to bring glory to God, so that the nations will see and perhaps turn to him.
Amen. Hey, if you guys are cool with this, I thought maybe we could bring it down to this last section, even though, we could probably go down the whole, free will, sovereign choice of God stuff forever. Verse 30, though, I think this is interesting. I didn't get into it, of course. The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, not salvation, righteousness, have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith. That's just different language than the way we talk about stuff with God, right? We're all about salvation. Did it happen? Are you now in Jesus? But it is interesting that Paul uses more this idea of righteousness rather than salvation. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's powerful. Righteousness being the status by which you can stand before God.
Yeah. I mean, there's overlap, of course, right? But but it's very positive too, right? It's not like not the removal of sins, not I mean, it is justification, right? I mean, it's exact same concept. But you have honor. You have received you've received big time gifts, because righteousness is like the ultimate gift. Yeah. So what are you trying to say? That they got like the hookup gift? They became part of the benefaction relationship. They were showered with a perfect gift, and they just did it by trusting. Wow.
Yeah. I like the language because I think it reflects a desire to engage in something. I think that the Christian emphasis on salvation so often becomes one of just having something done to me and I'll just sit here saved. Whereas the idea of
passivity, right?
The idea of becoming
passivity, but it could create passivity.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea of becoming righteous seems to be more of it seems more relational. You're righteous in regard to what, God, and it does seem to be. It does seem to lend itself more towards a purposeful life. Now that you are participating in God's righteousness, how might you live? Whereas so much of the Christian world today is just saved, and as you said, it's a pretty passive thing.
Yeah, I feel more inspired to engage, right? If I've been given honor and I've been given status, am I just going to sit around with that? Or am I going to go to the nations? Am I going to be Jesus?
Yes.
Are we going to be the body of Christ and do what all of this was meant to do? Now go and bring all the nations back, which was the big plan of God from the start.
But you know what's kind of funny though, like how Paul's like saying in those verses, like 31 and 32, he's saying like, oh, like the Jews, like they didn't pursue righteousness like by succeeding the law, like because they didn't pursue it by faith, but as if it were based by works, you know. But wasn't that kind of like what the law actually was, though? Like they were never told to pursue it by faith, the law, right? Like it was literally a law of works, right?
Well,
No,
the,
there's
the,
a
the
lot of
first,
idea of trust in me, you'll never be put to shame. I mean, there's
love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. I mean, I think that
love
think that-
has said is the idea of allegiance and faith, right? So sorry to interrupt, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just that the law. I mean, I like we don't have time for all of this, but that the law was. I think of the law as okay. I have my sons; they live in my house, and I love them, and I want them to love me. But then there's like this. This is how the Reeses live. The Reeses don't do this, and the Reeses do this, and so it's like you're my sons, and this is how you're going to behave, so that the world will see that you are my sons, and you can bring honor to the family. But behaving in the way that I want my sons to behave is interconnected with the love that I want them to have for me, but it is not a replacement for the love that I want them to have for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So maybe it was that they were supposed to realize that they couldn't do it. Maybe by you know what I mean? Maybe there was just this natural kind of. It's almost like you'd have to be almost arrogant to think that you were actually following the law perfectly.
Yeah.
Right, because we all seem to think they kind of were, I feel like, right? In the New Testament, a lot of them seem to, like, remember the young rich ruler was like, yeah, I've kept these things since my youth. A lot of them would say that too. Like, yeah, I'm kept the law perfectly, but then Jesus said that just wasn't true at all. He said that none of them kept it.
Yeah.
So maybe is it almost like they should have, instead it was almost like they were failing in the law to a certain extent and then thinking they were completely succeeding in it. But it was really meant to bring them to Christ, whether even if it was before Christ came, just this idea that you need Christ to look forward to it or something.
Yeah. I think that maybe good adherence to the law without faith leads to arrogance and an earned and something you've earned from God, or God owes you something, and it maybe takes away the realization of just how weak we all are.
Hmm.
What's interesting in this passage is that Jesus is not mentioned.
Kind of, though, right at the end. Isn't he kind of mentioned at the end there a little bit with that stumbling stone?
Right. I mean, he's alluded to, right? And
but not mentioned.
And I think the Messiah is alluded to as well. But
with the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
What
do you think that's about?
I'm not sure, honestly. I mean, other than we're meant to recognize it for sure as the stumbling or rock of offense. But yeah, I'm not sure how purposeful that is on Paul's part. Maybe saying Jesus is in itself a stumbling stone to the Jews, and it's better just to keep it at the Messiah level.
Oh, wow.
Right, rather than use that provocative word.
Wow.
Because whatever it takes, right? Hey, if I got to blot my name out of the book of life. I mean, we have the Messiah in verse 5 and 3, but we don't, but that's not, it's, the Jews are cool with the Messiah, right? 1, 3, and 5. But then after that, not really at all, other than when we get to the very end there with the stumbling stone. Anyway, I thought that was interesting too, how purposeful that is or not.
That is interesting. And Ed, today in your lesson too, can you explain a little bit more thoroughly? Because I didn't really like fully understand it, but it seemed interesting. But with like the remnant of Israel compared to the spiritual Israel, that whole thing.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to get into that way more in the upcoming chapters, but only because it starts out with, but the passage I had, verse 6, is not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. So we got to deal with that. So what do you think he means by that? And later, he's going to say, look at all these Gentiles, look at the church, look at this combination of believing Jews and believing Gentiles. They are spiritual Israel. He's going to say that later. But I think what he's saying here is within Israel, there's, not all of Israel is Israel. If we're trying to see if the word of God has, that's what I was trying to say, that, hey, there's all the nations, and then there's Abraham. There's all of Abraham's kids, and then there's Isaac. There's all of Isaac's kids, and then there's Jacob or Israel. And then even within Israel, you know what? We're not talking, God's okay with making choices inside groups. That's why I think he's talking about not all, I think he's still leaving it to ethnic Israel here, but within ethnic Israel, God makes choices.
Yeah, that makes sense, because even on 27 and 28, he's basically saying that, right? He's quoting that, saying that, only a remnant of them will be saved, of Israel.
And I think that's for sure, right? From that. Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting.
But that'll become more fluid as we make our way through 10 and 11. We'll talk about it, I guess, then.
And you think that same parallel then is for Christians too?
Well, that's the weeds and the tares, right? I mean,
yeah.
Jesus is the one who talks about that. Hey, the church is going to be filled with a whole bunch of people. And, some will say to me on that day, hey, didn't you teach us in the streets? And I never knew you. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even like the parable of the sower, right? Like the 4 different seeds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he kind of filters it out, basically. That's a little a little frightening. But
well,
yeah.
I think keep our allegiance, and let's keep aligned with the purpose of God, and we'll more likely enjoy our allegiance, more likely enjoy our walk, and be bulletproof to whatever the enemy's trying to do to taunt us or tease us away.
Exactly. As long as I keep hanging out with Tim Reese, then I feel pretty good then.
Yeah, and we're more than conquerors. I mean, we're going to have to make that decision on our own. Nothing can separate us. We would have to become embittered. I think we become embittered at some point, and that's when we check on out. So, I think we did it. What do you think?
That was a long one.
Brothers, thank you so much. This is I completely enjoyed just listening to you guys. That's awesome, man.
And throwing in too. All right, I'm gonna close this out here. We'll be back together for Romans 10.